and I ain't got nothing to say.
I got interested in making whiskey because I grew up in Kentucky and was from more the sort of coal mining, Appalachian, moonshining part of Kentucky. And when I moved to New York, people would say, "Oh, you're from Kentucky, you must know about bourbon, you must know about this and that." And I didn't, and sort of was from the wrong part of Kentucky. But I wanted to learn about bourbon, and I kind of, through getting interested in that, got even more interested in moonshine and sort of this kind of unaged whiskey. And if you remove age as the variable that makes whiskey good, what are the other variables that make whiskey good? And there's a lot of speculation on that. But I got interested in just getting a little tiny still off the internet and started distilling at home, which is illegal, but it was enough to kind of get me going, and sort of learned enough that at a certain point it felt like, oh, maybe actually there's more to this than just a hobby, and maybe it's actually a business. So it was kind of a little bit of cultural background, and then a little bit of sort of scientific curiosity that got to where we are now. Well, I think what makes me most proud is that we do everything here, for instance. I mean, that's a big deal. And it's kind of this mix of what would be traditional to Kentucky, and then what would be traditional to maybe Scotland, or what would be traditional to some older model of whiskey making. And it's not necessarily trying to self-consciously replicate the past, but for instance, using a pot still was something that when I was distilling, even in my apartment at a very small scale, afforded great latitude when trying to find the flavor profile of a distillation run. So, for instance, as we grew, we always said we want to have pot stills because it allows us to keep that flavor profile. Fermenting in open fermenters was something that also kind of goes back to that hobby distilling time. So for me, it was a lot of, as I was learning to be a distiller, trial and error, and then as we have scaled up the distillery, maintaining the values that I kind of discovered as a small-scale distiller. Well, there was this character, Harvey Washington Wiley, who was kind of this advocate in the 1900s for the Pure Food and Drug Act, which kind of in the 1900s there was this moment in American whiskey where a lot of people were taking vodka and they were putting in wood chips and they were putting in glycerin and they were putting in sort of all of these adulterants to make it cheaper to produce whiskey. And then there were kind of the traditionalists who were making pot distilled whiskey in Kentucky. And so he, as a government legislator, in a way kind of defined American whiskey what it is, and was instrumental in the Bottled in Bond Act, which kind of says that when you buy a bottle of whiskey, it comes from a particular distillery. And that's the government's sort of proof that this person is actually making the whiskey. So I think that's actually relevant now when there's a lot of so-called craft distilleries that are outsourcing their production. It's kind of instructive to look back into history and see how people dealt with this problem 100 years ago, because it was absolutely a problem then as much as now. And I think his insistence that whiskey is defined by the distillery from which it comes, and also by the distiller who makes it, that's also a part of the Bottled in Bond Act, I think is very meaningful to me as a distiller. So I like to drink whiskey neat in the winter and with an ice cube in the summer. I tend not to make a lot of cocktails because I'm, for the most part, always checking in on the product. I mean, there's an aspect of work that goes into it. But if I'm drinking someone else's whiskey, I tend to prefer to drink white whiskey when I'm visiting another distillery, because I think I can learn a lot about that distiller from their white whiskey. But when I'm just drinking pure, like, bourbon for fun, I'll probably just drink it neat and Well, the next next Facebook update, I hope, is that we are releasing this single malt, which we've just taken out of barrels, and it's now sitting in the tank at barrel strength. So Ryan and Nicole, who are the blenders, really found kind of two different styles of flavor that came from the barrels that we had. So there's one that's a little more delicate, a little more peaty, and then one that's a little bit more like an American whiskey, a little less peaty. And so hopefully we can share those with people for the first time, even though this is something that we made more than 2 years ago. So it's been a project that's been a long time in development and something that I think is really cool, and I look forward to sharing that.
in the dark. Even if